and try to set things straight as to how you practice the gift of tongues. And so notice, fourthly, this morning, how should unknown tongues be practiced? And it's taught very clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Remember, there are three words to remember. First is the word edification. The tongues were to be used for edification. Verse 26. When you come together, everyone has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. All of these must be done for the strengthening of the church. Now remember, they did not have the Bible. The Bible wasn't written. They couldn't turn to some chapter and verse in the Bible. So God spoke to the early Christians through the Holy Spirit. And so there was speaking in tongues. There was God spoke to them. There were revelations and those kinds of experiences because they didn't have the Bible. And of course, once you start dealing with that kind of an experience, you have to be really careful to make sure it's genuine. And so Paul does give words here to remember. He says, first of all, remember it's for edification. It's not for show. It doesn't mean you're more spiritual than anybody else. It was simply a way that God was edifying the church or strengthening the church in that first century. Second word we remember is organization, or orderliness, if you prefer. You see this in verses 27, 28, 33, verse 40, and verse 40 kind of sums it all up. Everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. You see, what was happening at Corinth was confusion. And God is not the God of confusion. And so Paul is very clear that if you're going to practice the gift of tongues and interpretation of tongues, it must be done in an orderly fashion. God sets forth the order, and we see, actually, God is the God of order. Whatever he does is orderly. It's kind of interesting. For example, next time you go to the grocery store, look around, and you'll see the evidence that God is a God of organization, of orderliness. For example, stop at the banana counter. And it's very interesting to observe bananas because it's very orderly. Every bunch of bananas has on its lowest row an even number of bananas, and each new row decreases by one so that one row has an even number and the next row has an odd number. Do you believe that? Well, I went and checked it out at the grocery store, and I'm sure I hope they didn't know who I was, but I'm going to go around and look at these bananas, and you start look. Well, sure enough, 4, 3, 2, 1, every one I looked at. And I tried not to touch them because I didn't want to buy every one, but, yeah, isn't that interesting? If you don't believe me, go try it for yourself. And if it's not true, someone has ripped a banana off. But anyway, if you see them naturally, that's exactly right. Because God is a God of order. Now, keep looking around. Go over and buy a watermelon if they're for sale, and you'll notice that there are an even number of stripes on the rind. You can go to any watermelon, and you can count those stripes, and they're always an even number. Well, I can't get a watermelon now, but you can buy an orange. Go and buy an orange and cut it in half, and you will find that no matter what orange you cut in half, there are an even number of segments. Well, you say, haven't convinced. Well, then, if you can buy a cob of corn, do that. And what is interesting on corn, you can begin to count the rows, and every single time there's an even number of rows. All this orderliness in nature, and who created nature? God. God is a God of order. And as you look around in the store, if you're not convinced, go out at night and look at the sky. And you begin to see when you look up, there's a God of order. You have all these planets, etc., in space, all moving according to their own orbit, not banging into each other, not changing how they're going to operate, but everything that God does has perfect order. And if it doesn't convince you by looking up with the telescope, look down with a microscope. Look at a snowflake, if you should be so unfortunate to live in a place where there's snow. But if you do, take a snowflake and put it under magnification, and every snowflake is perfect. Very, very orderly. God is a God of order, and Paul is really makes it a point. But, if you're going to practice tongues, it must be in order. This next picture seems to be what happens oftentimes in our day. People begin to practice tongues, and there's a loud noises, and different people are talking, and they're waving hands, and there's all this sort of confusion. If someone comes in and doesn't know anything about that, they would be totally turned off by all this confusion. And Paul says, that's not to be. The gift of tongues is to be expressed with orderliness. Back to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 27 and 28. If anyone speaks in a tongue or two, or at the most three, should speak one at a time, and someone must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God. What's interesting to me as I've been studying this again is there's sort of a restraint. Whenever Paul talks about this particular work of the Holy Spirit, there's a sense of restraint. Be very careful how you use it. One or two, and rarely three, but he said at times there's three. But you have, for example, the number there. No more than two persons who speak in tongues. On a rare occasion, there may be three. That's the meaning of it in the Greek. One, two, maybe three. And then there's the order. They are not to speak all at once, but there's to be one who speaks and then another, then in turn there may be a third. If there is confusion, it's not of God, because God is not a God of confusion. 1 Corinthians 14:33. And this seems to be his great emphasis on this particular gift. Be very careful how you use it. The third word is interpretation. Verse 27. And someone must interpret. Verse 28. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself. Very interesting. Now, wasn't raised in a church that spoke in tongues, and I do not have that gift. But when I was pastoring in South Bend, Indiana, there was a pastor, one of the larger churches there, Dr. Lester Sumrall was his name. Anybody here? The wonderful, very godly man. And Dr. Sumrall, when I first came to South Bend, I met him. And of all the pastors that I met, it was Dr. Sumrall who looked at me and he said, John, if there is anything we can do to help you, you let us know. Wow. Most of the other pastors saw me as a threat. And so here was Dr. Sumrall, and to the day I left, he was so gracious, and he had me on his TV broadcast and so on. We were worlds apart as far as how we conducted public services, but he was a very gracious man. And so after I got to know him a while on vacation, we went there for a Sunday service. It happened to be a communion service. And as the communion was being passed out, a lady spoke in tongues, and Dr. Sumrall interpreted it. Now, as I had studied at that point, I thought, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Now, if someone else speaks in tongues, there needs to be another interpreter, but a second person spoke in tongues, and Dr. Sumrall interprets it. And then there was a man who spoke in tongues, and Dr. Sumrall interpreted. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting that he does all the interpreting. He could say whatever he wanted to say, but he wasn't that type. But I thought, I don't think that's right. I just don't think that's right. And, you know, I never thought it was right until the last couple of weeks that I've been studying this. It's very interesting as you begin to look at this in the Greek New Testament that word someone